Alastair, you say that cybersecurity is now front of mind, but we have seen governments over the last 10, 15 years effectively bolting on legislation and regulation as they try and play catch up. As we move into an age which we talked about in a panel session this morning with artificial intelligence, is it still the case that government and business processes are still a little too slow and cumbersome to try and keep up, that they have levels of accountability to taxpayers or stakeholders, shareholders, and they have needs for transparency in processes that are simply too slow for this era?
So is the implication that of our procurement processes, how we purchase things? I mean, there's always going to be people that can talk about how government purchases things.
How we purchase things, but also how long it takes to change things.
So pretty remarkable stuff. The TSSR, the legislation relating to telecommunications sector security, was passed by Parliament and comes into effect later this year, not too far away. Gives significant power to the government to look at security issues in what is one of those underlying fabrics for cybersecurity. If there were two sectors that are most important, it's the telecommunications sector and the electricity generation and transmission sector. If you don't have power and you don't have internet, pretty much the rest of critical infrastructure fails. So I'd say that the government is ahead on that type of legislation. Not for me to create or suggest the creation of new regulations or legislation, but I feel that as a public servant working with industry, pretty well empowered to go about my business, and certainly a significant shift in that desire to work. That's been the most important thing for us. Information sharing is the other bit, and it's not a lack of data, it's how you interpret data and turn it into actionable intelligence that actually matters.
Thank you. And a question?
Thank you. Carla Horveg from Challenger Limited. Alastair, I was interested to hear about moving CERT Australia into the Australian Signals Directorate. How does that compare to the CERTs around the world? Is that something that happens in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, so one of our closest analogues is the UK. For a whole range of reasons. The National Cybersecurity Centre is part of GCHQ, the equivalent of ASD in the UK, and the UK CERT is part of the NCSC. In other countries, government agencies, well, most of the CERTs around the world are now run, there are multiple CERTs in each economy. Most of the central economy CERTs are run by government agencies, and there are a number where an intelligence agency is the CERT. I would add that with the shift, it has accelerated what ASD was becoming anyway, which is both a cybersecurity and a signals intelligence agency. And we need to be really careful when we talk about our roles as putting a distinction between the two. Through understanding how computers and network devices operate, if you're exploiting them, you have a much better idea of understanding how to protect them. Our function inside Australia is to protect systems, not conduct any form of intelligence activities, but to protect systems, and the movement of CERT into the Signals Directorate as it takes on that role as the mandated cybersecurity agency, which it's always had a role to be, but to make sure that from nose to tail through the whole economy, we take on that role. It makes good sense. Makes good sense in terms of how we use resources, obviously, so it prevents duplication, but also it gives us more of a complete picture of the events we're looking at. And CERT has a long and proud history. I remember when CERT didn't exist and when AusCERT was run out of the University of Queensland as a not-for-profit. And those things evolve. This is the next logical evolution. People who deal with CERT won't see a change legally in how it operates or in the types of information they get. What they'll have the advantage of is the increased reach of the agencies combining.
And a question from this side.
Thanks very much. Hi, I'm Diane Smith-Gander. I'm on the board of CEDA. I'm also a non-executive director of Wesfarmers and AGL, both good customers of PageUp. Alastair, that was a great presentation, thank you. And I have to say, I feel a bit more secure now and happy
job
that
done.
you're...
That's good.
Yeah, well, not quite yet. I've got a question.
Let Mr Taylor know. That's good.
Yeah, look, you talked about our new data privacy regulation, and as I understand it, there's a bit of alignment between that and the EU General Data Protection Regulation. And I understand that in that GDPR there is a privacy by design requirement, which I think means that companies, if they get into trouble, have to be able to show that they did think about designing in privacy. I'm a bit interested whether you think we've got that here in Australia, whether we should have it. If so, how would you regulate it? And can you then extend something like that into sort of cyber resilience by design, which I think is where we've got to go?
Well, thanks for the question. I can say that AGL is a great partner of one of the joint cybersecurity centres, for example, and a great corporate citizen when it comes to the sharing of threat intelligence and information. And one of the things, firstly, for me to emphasise is we can't succeed as government alone. I know everyone says that. When it comes to cybersecurity, the vast bulk of what we're trying to secure are actually not Australian government systems, and they're owned and operated by the private sector. And so this is a partnership. I might start first on the GDPR, the European privacy regulations, and the UK equivalent, and start with the PageUp incident. PageUp had to notify the UK market because their requirements are very tight. Within 72 hours, I think, of a suspicion. Our mandatory data, and I'm not the Privacy Commissioner, so I apologise to Angeline, who's the Acting Privacy Commissioner, if I get her act wrong. Our requirements aren't as compulsive in the early stages. PageUp, in a sense, was victimised by having to report to the UK market on a matter, and then if they hadn't reported in Australia at the same time, then the allegation people would make is you held back, you waited months because that's how long you could do in Australia if you're investigating actively, etc., before you came out. Because of that, they came out to the market earlier than logically they should have, because if they had had more time, they could have said, look, there's no evidence, for example, that data's been exfiltrated. I understand the risk decisions made, by the way, for companies to turn off some services. And when a few people run on a company, boards will start asking the questions of their head of risk, or why are we still using a service that some other big players have turned off? At some point, we need to stop and say, what is the real risk and threat? And to know in cybersecurity terms, lightning often doesn't strike in the same place twice, too quickly. And if you've been a victim and you go through this lovely public episode that we have, it is unlikely that that same exploit is going to be used against you in the near term. And they might end up being a more secure organisation. Hopefully all will be. You asked the question of, so in a sense, this conflict of laws means that even if our privacy legislation is different, if you're a multinational company or providing services in a range of economies, you have to choose the act that is most onerous upon you. And then if you are a multinational, you should be applying that to all of your footprint, which in this case I think was detrimental to PageUp. And I apologise for talking about PageUp, and I apologise to them for talking about them, but they are the most recent public case. As to privacy by design, I'm going to add safety by design, because my successor as the E-Safety Commissioner, Julian McGrant, speaks about safety by design, that services that you roll to market should not harm people, particularly if you provide internet-based services. And I'm going to add security by design. Microsoft learnt years ago that they needed to start coding more securely at the start of writing code, because they developed a reputation in the 90s and the early 2000s as being insecure. So they built into their practices this concept of security by design. And you saw quite a dramatic shift in relation to the products that they shipped to us as businesses and consumers. And there is no reason for us not to be building in privacy, safety and security enhancing processes into the technologies that we roll out, either in business and government or to the public. What data do you collect and why are you collecting it? do you really need it to do your business? Having come from the background after I left the police into corporates, they would often collect information thinking somehow it would help reduce fraud, increase their ability to understand who they were transacting with, and often it wasn't the case. So I often advocated inside those businesses, collect less, but do more with what you collect to understand who it is that you're dealing with. How long do you keep it for, and how long is it relevant for? How do you store it when you have it? These are all about privacy, safety and security by design. Build it in at the start. The old saying that prevention is better than cure is definitely the case when it comes to cybersecurity. Prevent what you can, design out the issue. If you don't collect the data's not there to lose. If you collect the data and you hash it properly and encrypt these things properly, lose it all you like, it's white noise. And it cannot be unpicked by the offender. Asterisks. So by building those things in the design phase, it's not just better for your customers and for your business, it's better in the long run for the inevitable failures that we have as businesses and governments. And then it comes to the maturity question. I'm sorry for taking so long to answer. But that comes to the maturity issue now. So when Commonwealth Bank had to come out to the market to say that it had lost some tapes, backup tapes recently, do people recall that? The likelihood of that ever impacting upon any Australian citizen was probably as close to zero as you can get. But because they felt compelled under the new data loss provisions that they had to come to the market, people didn't rationally sit there and say, right, you need a special type of machine to read it. Someone vexatious had to get access to these things. You then have to interpret it, which is really tough. You've even got to play the tapes at the right speed because it depends on how you've compressed them. A lot of rational things mitigated against that actually being a threat, but that's not necessarily what the headline said. And we need to be much smarter, much more nuanced as we go about our business, because it is inevitable that we will lose data. It's inevitable that people will compromise systems. It's inevitable they're going to knock them offline. I've spent my whole life dealing with criminals, and that's what they do. We just need to be as better than them as often as we can, and smart enough as a nation to learn when they succeed.
You've mentioned a number of times throughout your presentation answering the questions, things that people don't know, whether they don't know how serious a data breach is because they don't know the language. I'd also say most of us really don't know how these devices we rely on work. We also don't know or don't take the time to figure out how much of our privacy we're giving up when we click the licence agreement because we want the latest app to download so we can do things. How much is cybersecurity about saving people from themselves, from their either lack of knowledge or sometimes lack of willingness to find out?
So I'm going to start by talking about informed consent. And say that informed consent is really important, and I'm not convinced necessarily that we give our informed consent. I won't comment on the articles today about medical data and whether or not that being shared with law firms indeed matched the informed consent of what people clicked on when they used an app to make medical bookings. Do they know how their data is used? Is an interesting question. And informed consent at the time of you engaging with the business or government is not necessarily what then gets done with information as innovations occur in business. And we need to work out a way somehow to have proper informed consent, because businesses can and should use data. And then how to make sure that that evolves with the use of the data. And it's a really tough question, I think, in a modern economy. But ultimately, we as consumers and citizens own our data. There are compulsions in government, there's no doubt, and if there are privacy people in the room, we can have a long debate about that. When it comes to business and profiting from data, that's okay. We want people to run successful businesses, but you want them to run it in a way that the public actually understands. If you are using a free product and the company makes billions of dollars worth of profit from that free product that is you, then your data is being used in ways that you may not necessarily have given informed consent for. And I think we need to be much smarter in how we acknowledge how our data is used, whether the data can continue to be used after a certain time, and when you change your business practices, how you get people to re-consent to how data is used. On the broader topic, We often think that because we use technology, we're smart at technology. And in many respects, we've made technology so easy to use that we don't have to understand what goes on in the background. And the more we can do to actually have the next generation not just use technology, which we want them to do, obviously, too late anyway, but to use it in an informed way, and even better still, informed in terms of their consent, but informed in terms of understanding what happens underneath that glass. Because in many respects, we're dumber users by the day, and that doesn't bode well for security or safety or privacy.
Is anyone else in the audience? Yep.
Hi, Jenny Murray from First State Super. You've talked about it from the point of view of giving informed consent or how the companies use our data, but then there's also the flip side of when we want to exit from those practices or apps or whatever it may be, businesses, etc. We really don't have enough legislation around that yet, do we? In being able to take our information back and it not staying within the businesses?
So I think it's something that is increasingly part of the conversation. The government accepted, I think it was a Productivity Commission report in data, and the concept of private right of action and the concept of the citizen owning their data. And I think this will evolve over time. Part of it is we will similar to the GDPR, will be caught up in global or regionally specific legislation because of the global nature of the companies that we deal with. You saw this in banking regulations and other countries imposing things upon banks. If you have a correspondent relationship with a bank in another jurisdiction, then you often fall into the requirements of that bank that you have a correspondent relationship with. And I think we'll see the same when it comes to technologies. So I'm not convinced everything has to be Australian-based regulation or legislation. Some of it will just come by default. If you're talking specifically about the right to be forgotten, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in Europe. There's probably a difference between the right to be forgotten and the right to not have my data used anymore by a company to profit. So I'm not asking them to expunge my files, I'm just asking them to stop using them for the purposes that they were collected for. And there's plenty of anecdotal evidence to say that it's really tough to shut down some services. And it's probably important that we increasingly debate that as a society.
That's where we'll have to leave it, Alastair. Thank you very much for your time. That was fascinating, as usual.